The massive cypress trees stood like ancient sentinels in the fading light, their twisted roots disappearing into black water that reflected nothing but darkness. Rex stopped so abruptly that Jack nearly stumbled over him. The German shepherd's entire body had gone rigid, every muscle tense beneath his thick coat. His ears pinched forward, his tail dropped low, and a low, continuous growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Jack followed the dog's intense gaze through the tangled undergrowth to where an enormous structure loomed in the shadows. A nest so large it seemed impossible, wedged between 3 massive branches 30 feet above the swamp floor. But something was profoundly wrong. The great bald eagle perched atop the nest wasn't diving at them, wasn't screeching territorial warnings. Instead, the magnificent bird stood perfectly still, wings slightly spread, looking down not at the intruders, but at something below the nest itself. Then Jack heard it. A sound so soft and fragile it barely registered over the whisper of wind. The unmistakable cry of a newborn baby. Rex's growl shifted pitch, becoming urgent, desperate, and Jack felt ice flood his veins. This wasn't about the nest at all. This was about what the mother eagle was defending underneath it. Something human, something alive, something in terrible danger. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Jack Morrison had served his country for 12 years as a canine handler with Special Operations Forces, leading dogs through some of the most dangerous terrain imaginable. He'd trained military working dogs to detect explosives, track insurgents, and protect their handlers with fierce loyalty that transcended the boundary between species. When he'd finally come home to the small town bordering Georgia's Okefenokee Swamp, he'd thought his fighting days were over. The cabin he'd chosen sat on the edge of civilization, a place where a man could find peace, or at least escape the memories that haunted him. But peace had proven elusive. 2 years ago, a drunk driver had stolen his wife Sarah from him. In a senseless collision on Highway 177, the grief had nearly destroyed him, leaving him hollow and directionless in a world that suddenly felt unbearably empty. But it was another loss that had shattered his soul completely, leaving wounds that never quite healed. Duke, his military working dog, his partner, his brother, his best friend in ways that transcended words. Duke had been a German shepherd of exceptional intelligence and courage, a dog who'd saved Jack's life, more times than he could count during their 5 years deployed overseas. On their final mission, during what should have been a routine patrol that had turned into a vicious ambush, Duke had detected the trap seconds before Jack would have walked into certain death. The dog had shoved Jack backward with such force that both of them had tumbled down an embankment, and then the shooting had started. Jack remembered the chaos, the explosions, Duke's body jerking as 3 rounds tore into him. He remembered cradling his dying partner, feeling the dog's blood soak into his uniform, watching the light fade from those intelligent brown eyes that had looked at him with absolute trust until the very end. He'd made Duke a promise that day, whispered it through tears as the dog's breathing stopped and his body went still. He would never forget, never stop honoring the sacrifice of the bravest soul he'd ever known. The military had told him Duke died a hero. They'd given Jack a folded flag and a commemorative plaque that now hung above his fireplace. But those things couldn't fill the emptiness, couldn't bring back the presence that had made him feel less alone, even in the darkest moments of war. What Jack didn't know, what the military had never told him because they themselves didn't know, was that Duke hadn't died that day. The medical evacuation team had found the dog still breathing, barely, his body shattered, but his heart still fighting. Emergency surgery at a forward operating base had saved Duke's life, but the injuries were catastrophic. Multiple bullet wounds, fractured bones, nerve damage that would take months of intensive rehabilitation to overcome. Worse than the physical trauma was the psychological damage. Duke had developed severe PTSD, triggered by gunfire, explosions, even raised voices. The military veterinarians had done everything they could, performing multiple reconstructive surgeries that changed the dog's appearance, especially around his face and shoulders, where scar tissue had formed. When Duke had finally recovered enough to be assessed, the decision had been made. He could never return to active duty. The dog was too traumatized, too unpredictable in combat situations. But he was also too valuable to be put down. His intelligence and training were extraordinary, even if he could no longer serve in war zones. So Duke had been quietly transferred to a civilian rehabilitation program, given a new name to start fresh, and eventually placed in the adoption system. The paperwork listed him as Rex, a rescued shepherd with unknown history. No one connected him to the decorated military working dog who'd supposedly died a hero 3 years earlier. And when a broken veteran named Jack Morrison had walked into that shelter, neither the man nor the dog had recognized each other. One because Duke's appearance had changed so dramatically, the other because Duke's trauma had fragmented his memories of those final moments. But somewhere deep in Duke's canine brain, beneath the fear and confusion, a connection remained, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Then, 13 months ago, when Jack had gone to the local animal rescue out of obligation to the director who'd served in the army herself, he'd expected to feel nothing. He couldn't replace Duke. He wouldn't even try. But when the shepherd now called Rex had been brought into the meeting room, something had stirred in Jack's chest. Not recognition, but a strange sense of familiarity he couldn't explain, like encountering someone from a half-remembered dream. The dog had approached cautiously, his gait slightly uneven from old injuries, and sniffed Jack's extended hand. Then he'd done something remarkable. He'd sat at attention in perfect military form and extended his right paw in what looked almost like a salute, a gesture no shelter dog should have known. Jack had felt his breath catch. For just a moment, he'd seen Duke in this stranger's eyes. But the thought was too painful, too impossible, so he'd pushed it away and focused on practicalities. Jack had adopted him that same day, naming him Rex because he needed a fresh start, a new beginning for both of them. Over the following months, Rex had become Jack's anchor to life, the reason he got up each morning, the companion who understood without words when the nightmares came screaming back in the darkness. But Jack kept emotional distance, building walls around the part of his heart that had died with Duke. He cared for Rex, trained with him, relied on him, but never loved him the way he'd loved Duke. He couldn't. That space in his heart remained a memorial to the partner he'd lost, a shrine he wouldn't desecrate by trying to replace what could never be replaced. Still, he couldn't ignore the strange things that kept happening, the odd moments that made him question his own assumptions about this dog who'd come into his life. Rex responded to commands Jack had never taught him, executing them with military precision that seemed instinctive rather than learned. When Jack unconsciously used hand signals from his military days, signals specific to his old unit, not standard civilian dog training, Rex obeyed instantly, perfectly, without hesitation or confusion. The dog understood tactical whistle codes that Jack had developed exclusively with Duke. He knew how to search for explosives, even though Jack had never trained him in detection work, demonstrating techniques that required months of specialized instruction. Sometimes, late at night, when Jack woke gasping from nightmares of that final ambush, Rex would place his head on Jack's chest in exactly the way Duke used to do, the weight and warmth of it slowing Jack's racing heart and pulling him back from the edge of panic. Once, in a moment of grief-stricken confusion after a particularly vivid nightmare, Jack had called out Duke instead of Rex, and the dog had spun around so fast his entire body vibrated with what looked unmistakably like recognition and joy. But Jack had dismissed it all as coincidence, as his traumatized mind seeing connections that didn't exist because he wanted so desperately to believe in impossible things. German shepherds were smart, he told himself. This one had obviously been trained by someone with military experience before being abandoned. That was the logical explanation, the rational answer. Jack never let himself consider the impossible alternative, that the universe might be merciful enough to give him back what he'd lost, that miracles might exist for men like him after all. 3 weeks ago, Sarah Chen had moved into the small house 2 miles down the dirt road from Jack's cabin, bringing with her an enthusiasm for wilderness research that was both impressive and slightly concerning to someone who understood how dangerous Okefenokee could be. She was a wildlife biologist from Atlanta, drawn to the swamp by research opportunities and a desire to escape the stress and artificiality of city life. Brilliant and passionate about conservation, Sarah had immediately impressed Jack with her academic knowledge and genuine love for the natural world, though she clearly lacked practical experience in genuinely dangerous wilderness environments. She'd started visiting Jack's cabin regularly, asking questions about the swamp's hidden areas, the routes locals used, the wildlife patterns only longtime residents understood through hard-won experience. She brought detailed maps and research papers, but Jack knew that maps couldn't show you where the ground would swallow you whole or where alligators nested in the murky shallows. Then she'd told him about something extraordinary she'd observed. Deep in the restricted zones of Okefenokee, where even rangers rarely ventured because of the treacherous terrain, a pair of bald eagles had built a nest of unusual size, far larger than typical eagle nests, constructed with an almost frantic intensity. But more remarkable was the behavior Sarah had documented through her long-range observation equipment over several weeks of patient watching. The mother eagle, which should have been aggressively territorial during nesting season, appeared to be protecting something beneath the nest structure itself, rather than just defending the eggs within it. The bird's behavior patterns were completely abnormal. She spent as much time looking downward as watching for threats from above. Sarah's recordings showed the eagle bringing food to the nest, but then dropping some of it below, as if feeding something on the ground. The behavior suggested she was guarding not just her own offspring, but something else. Something highly unusual. Sarah needed someone to guide her into that remote location, someone who knew how to navigate the treacherous waterways and dangerous terrain. She needed Jack. He'd initially refused, citing the very real risks of venturing that deep into the swamp. But Sarah had been persistent in a way that reminded him of the best young officers he'd served with, determined, intelligent, and unwilling to give up on something important. Then Tommy Briggs had gotten involved, changing the entire dynamic. Tommy was 12 years old, the grandson of Bill Briggs, who ran the general store in town and had been a friend of Jack's late father. The boy's father had died in Afghanistan 4 years earlier, leaving Tommy without a male role model at a critical age. The kid had latched onto Jack as a surrogate mentor, showing up at the cabin regularly to learn about survival skills, hear stories about military life, and simply be around someone who understood what his father had experienced. When Tommy heard about the expedition to find the mysterious eagle nest, he'd begged to come along, seeing it as the ultimate wilderness adventure and a chance to learn from the man he idolized. His eyes had shone with such hope and excitement that Jack found himself unable to refuse the boy, whose eyes reminded him so much of the young soldiers he'd once led into danger. Rex had made the decision easier in an unexpected way. For weeks, the dog had been acting strangely in ways that Jack couldn't explain through normal canine behavior. He would stare toward the deep swamp for hours at a time, completely motionless except for the occasional twitch of his ears, as if listening to something far beyond human hearing. At night, he paced restlessly, whining and occasionally letting out long, mournful howls that echoed across the water and made Jack's neighbors half a mile away call to ask if everything was all right. It was as if something out there was calling to Rex, pulling at him with invisible threads that only he could sense. When Jack finally agreed to guide Sarah and Tommy to the nest site, Rex's agitation had transformed into focused intensity, a sense of purpose Jack recognized from their military days with Duke. The dog seemed to understand that they were finally going where he needed them to go, toward something important that demanded his attention and protection. Jack Morrison's military service had shaped him into someone who understood survival at its most fundamental level, who could read terrain like other men read books, who knew that staying alive often meant trusting your instincts even when logic suggested otherwise. He'd spent 8 of his 12 years in the military working with K-9 units across 3 continents, developing an expertise that went far beyond simple dog training. He understood canine psychology, communication, and the extraordinary bond that could form between handler and dog when both lives depended on absolute trust. His specialty had been training German shepherds for explosive detection and tactical operations, work that required patience, intelligence, and an almost intuitive connection with animals whose senses far exceeded human capabilities. Duke had been his masterpiece, the dog who'd exceeded every expectation and become something more than a working animal, a true partner whose loyalty and courage had saved countless lives. After Duke's supposed death and his wife's tragic accident, Jack had retreated to the cabin near Okefenokee, not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion, needing space to process losses that had hollowed him out. The cabin itself was modest but well-maintained, built by his grandfather in the 1960s and passed down through the family. It sat on 5 acres of high ground surrounded by wetlands, with a clear view of the water and enough distance from neighbors to provide privacy. Inside, military efficiency met rustic simplicity. Everything had its place, nothing was wasted, and the walls displayed memories from a life of service. The flag from Duke's memorial service hung above the fireplace, and photographs showed Jack with various military working dogs over the years, though Duke's picture occupied the place of honor. Outside, Jack had built a training course where he'd once hoped to rehabilitate rescue dogs for police work. But that dream had faded after his wife's death. Now it served mainly as a place where Rex could exercise and maintain the physical fitness that seemed built into his very nature. The turning point in Jack's relationship with Rex had come 4 months after the adoption, during an incident that still gave Jack chills when he remembered it. They'd been deep in the swamp on one of their regular patrols when Jack had stepped onto what looked like solid ground, but was actually a thin mat of vegetation over sucking mud that immediately began pulling him under. He'd sunk to his waist in seconds, the cold muck dragging him down with relentless force. Panic had flashed through him. He was alone, no one knew exactly where he was, and the swamp could swallow a man without a trace. But Rex had reacted with stunning speed and precision, executing a rescue technique that military canines were trained for, but that Jack had never taught him. The dog had circled around to where a fallen log provided leverage, then backed toward Jack while keeping eye contact, waiting for Jack to grab his harness. When Jack had gotten a grip, Rex had pulled with all his strength, his training evident in how he maintained steady pressure instead of yanking, how he adjusted his position to maximize leverage, how he kept his body low to distribute weight. It had taken 5 agonizing minutes, but Rex had pulled Jack free, saving his life through techniques that should have been unknown to a shelter rescue dog. When they'd finally reached safe ground, both of them covered in mud and gasping for breath, Jack had looked into Rex's eyes and seen something that made his heart stop. For just a moment, he'd seen Duke looking back at him with that same expression of concern and determination. But the moment had passed, and Jack had convinced himself it was just gratitude and relief creating illusions. Still, from that day forward, Jack had trusted Rex with his life in ways he'd never quite articulated, even to himself. The dog had earned something precious. Not love, not yet, but profound respect, and the beginning of the kind of bond Jack had thought he'd never experience again. Sarah Chen represented a different kind of challenge for Jack, pulling him back toward human connection when he'd grown comfortable with isolation. At 35, she possessed the kind of passionate intelligence that reminded Jack of his late wife, though Sarah's focus was wildlife biology rather than education. She'd earned her doctorate from Georgia Tech with a dissertation on wetland ecosystems and their role in climate regulation, but had grown frustrated with academic politics and the distance between research and real-world conservation. Moving to Okefenokee was her way of making a difference, of studying and protecting one of America's most unique wilderness areas while living close to the land she loved. Sarah's arrival in the community had caused something of a stir in the small town. Educated, Asian American, single, choosing to live in rural Georgia rather than pursuing opportunities in major cities. Some locals had been welcoming, others suspicious, but Jack had simply been impressed by her genuine curiosity and willingness to learn. She didn't pretend to know more than she didn't dismiss local knowledge in favor of academic theories, and showed real respect for the people who'd lived alongside the swamp for generations. She'd sought out Jack specifically after hearing about his military background and his reputation as someone who understood the deep swamp better than almost anyone still living. Their early conversations had been stilted. Jack wasn't used to talking much anymore, but Sarah's questions had been intelligent, and her interest in his knowledge had been sincere rather than patronizing. Tommy Briggs, on the other hand, needed no such careful approach. The boy had simply shown up at Jack's cabin 6 months earlier, introduced himself, and announced that he wanted to learn survival skills from a real soldier. His directness had startled a laugh out of Jack, the first genuine laugh he'd experienced in months. Tommy's father, Lieutenant Marcus Briggs, had been killed by an IED in Kandahar province 4 years earlier, leaving behind a wife, a young son, and a community that had rallied around the family in their grief. Tommy's mother had eventually remarried and moved to Florida, but Tommy had chosen to stay with his paternal grandfather, unwilling to leave the town where his father's memory was still honored and present. Bill Briggs, the grandfather, ran the general store with the kind of steady competence that made him a pillar of the community, and he'd raised Tommy with love, but worried about the absence of a father figure in the boy's formative years. When Tommy had gravitated toward Jack, Bill had been quietly relieved, seeing in the veteran someone who could understand and guide his grandson in ways he couldn't. Tommy was bright, curious, and hungry for connection with someone who'd walked the same paths his father had walked. He asked questions constantly about military life, about survival techniques, about what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. Jack had resisted at first, uncomfortable with the responsibility, and unsure if he had anything valuable to offer a grieving child. But Tommy's persistence had worn him down. And somewhere along the way, the mentorship had become something Jack looked forward to rather than endured. Teaching the boy gave him purpose, made him feel useful again, and reminded him that life continued even after devastating loss. Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious, his questions forcing Jack to articulate knowledge he'd taken for granted, and his obvious admiration made Jack want to be worthy of it. When Tommy had begged to join the expedition to find the eagle nest, Jack had seen it as an opportunity to teach the boy real wilderness skills in a relatively controlled environment, or so he'd thought. The idea that they would encounter anything truly dangerous had seemed remote, a miscalculation that would nearly cost them everything. Preparing for the expedition had required 3 days of careful planning, gathering equipment, and ensuring everyone understood the risks they'd be taking. Jack approached it with military thoroughness, creating detailed plans for multiple contingencies and insisting that everyone follow protocols without exception. He assembled survival gear that included water purification tablets, emergency rations, first aid supplies extensive enough to handle serious injuries, waterproof communication devices, and weapons, both a rifle for large predators and a pistol that would be easier to deploy quickly. He insisted Sarah and Tommy each carry their own survival packs, lighter than his, but equipped with everything needed to spend a night in the swamp if they got separated. He reviewed hand signals, whistle codes, and emergency procedures until both of them could recite them without hesitation. Sarah had been patient with his caution, understanding that his military background made thorough preparation instinctive. Tommy had been excited by all the equipment and procedures, seeing them as proof that this was a real mission rather than just a nature hike. Jack briefed them on Okefenoke's specific dangers in detail that bordered on frightening. The swamp covered over 400,000 acres of Georgia and Florida, a vast wetland wilderness where water and land merged in ways that could disorient even experienced outdoorsmen. Alligators were everywhere, some reaching 14 feet in length and weighing over 500 pounds, capable of explosive speed despite their prehistoric appearance. Venomous snakes, cottonmouths, rattlesnakes, copperheads, thrived in the warm, wet environment and could strike from water or land with little warning. The water itself posed dangers, deep channels hidden beneath innocent-looking surfaces, acidic tannins that turned it black and made it impossible to see what lurked below. Rex had watched all the preparations with intense focus, his behavior shifting from the restless agitation of previous weeks to something more purposeful, more controlled. The morning of departure, Jack had made one final decision that would prove crucial later. He'd contacted Sheriff Bobby Martinez, an old friend from their youth who'd stayed in town while Jack had joined the military. Bobby had become sheriff 8 years earlier, respected by the community for his steady leadership and commitment to protecting the rural area's residents. Jack trusted Bobby implicitly, considering him one of the few people who'd checked on him regularly after his wife's death. He'd told Bobby their planned route, expected return time, and emergency protocols, standard procedure for anyone venturing deep into Okefenoke. Bobby had seemed genuinely concerned, asking detailed questions about their destination and suggesting they postpone the trip given recent reports of criminal activity in the area. Marcus Reed, Bobby had explained, had been released from prison 2 weeks earlier after serving 5 years for illegal logging operations. Reed had been a powerful figure in the county before his arrest, wealthy from timber operations that had later been revealed as cover for extensive illegal activities. Bobby worried that Reed might be planning revenge against those who'd testified against him, including Jack, who'd provided evidence about illegal clear-cutting on protected land. The warning had given Jack pause, but he'd dismissed it as overcaution. Reed wouldn't be stupid enough to commit crime so soon after release, not with law enforcement watching him closely. Besides, the area they'd be exploring was far from any logging operations, deep in protected wilderness, where Reed would have no reason to go. Bobby had reluctantly accepted Jack's decision, but made him promise to check in via satellite phone every 12 hours. As Bobby had driven away from the cabin, Rex had done something unusual. He'd growled low in his throat, his hackles rising, watching the sheriff's vehicle disappear down the dirt road with unmistakable hostility. Jack had dismissed it as territorial behavior, never suspecting that his dog knew something his human instincts hadn't yet detected. If he'd listened to that warning, if he'd trusted Rex's judgment over his own assumptions, everything that followed might have been prevented. But hindsight offered no protection, and by the time Jack understood what Rex had been trying to tell him, they would all be fighting for their lives in the darkest heart of Okefenoke Swamp. They launched the kayaks at dawn, when mist still clung to the black water and the swamp was waking with the calls of unseen birds. Jack had chosen a 3-kayak configuration. He and Rex in the lead, Sarah in the middle with most of the scientific equipment, and Tommy bringing up the rear where Jack could keep an eye on him. The water was calm and dark as coffee, stained by tannins from centuries of decaying vegetation, creating an otherworldly landscape where Spanish moss draped from ancient cypress trees like tattered curtains. The air smelled of earth and water and life in all its profusion, a scent Jack had come to associate with both peace and danger. They paddled in silence for the first hour, following a narrow channel that twisted through stands of trees so thick that sunlight barely penetrated. Rex sat in the bow of Jack's kayak like a figurehead on an ancient ship, his posture alert and focused in ways that went beyond normal canine attentiveness. His ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds Jack couldn't hear, and his nose worked continuously, processing information from the air currents. What struck Jack most forcefully was how systematic Rex's surveillance appeared. Not the random curiosity of a pet, but the methodical scan of a trained military working dog conducting reconnaissance in hostile territory. Rex would focus on one sector for exactly 30 seconds, then shift to the next, covering a complete 360-degree sweep before beginning again. Jack had never taught him this technique, but he recognized it instantly because it was exactly how he'd trained Duke to provide security during field operations. The coincidence was becoming harder to dismiss, the similarities piling up in ways that made Jack's chest tighten with emotions he didn't want to examine. 2 hours into the journey, they encountered their first serious obstacle when Jack's kayak struck something beneath the surface, a submerged log or root system that brought them to an abrupt halt. He probed with his paddle and discovered they'd run into a dense tangle of cypress knees and underwater branches that blocked the entire channel. The only way forward was to get into the waist-deep water and physically maneuver the kayaks through the obstruction. Jack went first, testing the footing carefully before signaling the others to follow. The water was cold despite the warming day, and the bottom was uncertain. Solid mud in some places, sucking muck in others, with hidden gaps that could drop you into deeper water without warning. Sarah climbed out carefully, wincing as the cold water soaked through her waders, while Tommy followed with the controlled enthusiasm of someone determined to prove himself capable. They were making good progress, carefully threading the kayaks through the obstacle, when Rex suddenly went rigid in Jack's boat. The dog's entire body tensed, his head snapping toward the right bank with such intensity that Jack immediately stopped moving and signaled the others to freeze. For 10 seconds, nothing happened, just the quiet sounds of water lapping and birds calling in the distance. Then Jack saw it. A massive alligator sliding silently into the water from the bank 20 yards away, its prehistoric bulk easily 12 feet long and probably weighing close to 600 pounds. The creature's eyes fixed on them with the patient calculation of a predator assessing potential prey. Most alligators avoided humans, but a gator this size was old, experienced, and potentially dangerous if it felt threatened or simply hungry. Jack's hand moved slowly toward the pistol on his hip, but before he could draw it, Rex acted. The dog launched himself from the kayak into the water with zero hesitation, positioning himself between the approaching alligator and the 3 humans. What happened next made Jack's blood run cold with recognition. Rex didn't bark wildly or thrash in the water like a panicked animal. Instead, he executed a defensive formation Jack had seen before, positioning himself at a 45-degree angle to both the threat and his handlers, body low in the water to minimize profile, every muscle coiled and ready to either attack or deflect. This was advanced canine tactical training, the kind taught only to elite military working dogs who might face armed adversaries or dangerous wildlife in combat zones. Rex held the position perfectly, growling in a specific pattern, 3 short sounds, pause, 2 short sounds, that Jack recognized with shock as a military warning code, meaning threat present, holding position, ready to engage. Jack had created that code himself, used it exclusively with Duke, never taught it to anyone else or written it down anywhere. There was no possible way Rex could know it unless. But Jack couldn't let himself think that now, couldn't afford the distraction when they were all in danger. He moved slowly, drawing his pistol and taking aim at the alligator, which had stopped its approach and was watching Rex with what looked like uncertainty. The standoff lasted nearly a minute, tension thick enough to choke on, before the alligator apparently decided the situation wasn't worth the risk. The massive reptile sank beneath the surface and disappeared, leaving only ripples that quickly faded. Rex maintained his defensive position for another full minute, scanning for additional threats, before returning to the kayak with the same disciplined control he'd shown throughout. Sarah was staring at the dog with open amazement. Tommy looked like he'd just witnessed a superhero in action, and Jack felt his carefully constructed assumptions about Rex beginning to crumble, replaced by questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. They reached the high ground island an hour later, pulling the kayaks onto a small beach of packed earth and sand that provided the first solid footing they'd encountered since launching. Everyone was shaken from the alligator encounter, and Sarah's leg was bleeding slightly where she'd scraped it on a submerged branch during the confusion. Jack immediately went into medic mode, cleaning and bandaging the wound, while Rex conducted a security sweep of their temporary camp with the kind of thorough professionalism that no longer surprised Jack, but deeply unsettled him. Tommy helped gather dry wood for a small fire, not for warmth, but to boil water and provide psychological comfort in the primitive wilderness. While Jack worked on Sarah's injury and Tommy organized their gear, Rex completed his patrol and returned with something in his mouth. He dropped it at Jack's feet with a deliberate gentleness that suggested the object was important. It was a piece of fabric, torn and weathered, but still recognizable as part of a military uniform. Specifically, the same desert camouflage pattern that Jack's unit had worn during their deployments. The fabric was old, stained with what looked like dried blood. And when Jack examined it more closely, his heart stuttered. There, barely visible on the torn edge, was a fragment of a name tape. He could only make out 3 letters, but they were enough. Mior. The beginning of Morrison. This was his uniform, or part of it. But how had it gotten here? Thousands of miles from where he'd last worn it. Then Jack noticed something else that made his hands shake. The fabric had been cut, not torn, removed deliberately in what looked like a medical procedure, and Rex was reacting to it with intense focus, sniffing it repeatedly and looking at Jack with what seemed like desperate urgency, as if trying to communicate something crucial that Jack wasn't understanding. Sarah's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, sharp with alarm. She'd been examining the campsite while Jack was distracted and had made a disturbing discovery. There were signs of recent human activity scattered across the clearing. Cigarette butts, food wrappers, and most damning fresh sawdust from what could only be chainsaw work. Jack's military training kicked in immediately, and he began a systematic search that revealed more evidence. Cut branches showed saw marks only days old. Boot prints in the soft earth near the water's edge were fresh enough that the edges hadn't yet eroded. Someone had been working here recently, and given that this was protected wilderness where logging was absolutely prohibited, that meant criminal activity. Jack found a rusted toolbox half buried in undergrowth, its contents revealing professional logging equipment: wedges, measuring tapes, marking paint. Then Sarah called out from where she'd ventured to the clearing's edge, and something in her voice made everyone move quickly. She was standing at the boundary where forest met water, staring at a scene that shouldn't exist. At least a dozen cypress trees had been felled recently, their stumps showing bright wood not yet weathered by time or water. These were old-growth trees, centuries old, protected by federal law, each one worth thousands of dollars to poachers willing to risk prosecution. The trees had been sectioned and removed with professional efficiency, leaving only sawdust and destruction. Sarah was horrified, already calculating the ecological damage, but Jack was thinking tactically. Whoever had done this had invested significant time and resources, which meant they'd be back to harvest more. And that meant danger. Rex provided the next critical warning, his entire body suddenly going on high alert as he faced toward the northeast. His growl so low, Jack felt it more than heard it. Then Jack caught it too. The distant sound of motors, multiple engines running in coordination, coming closer. He gestured urgently for silence and led everyone to concealed positions behind a massive fallen log that provided both cover and a vantage point. The motors grew louder, and soon Jack could see movement through the trees. 3 flat-bottomed boats equipped with winches and logging equipment emerged into view, moving slowly through the water toward another stand of old-growth cypress. The first boat contained 2 men Jack didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals who moved with the casual competence of people comfortable with illegal work. But the second boat made Jack's chest tighten with recognition. Marcus Reed stood in the bow, older and harder than when Jack had last seen him in court 5 years ago, his face set in lines of bitterness and rage. Next to him was a younger man who could only be his son Cole, in his early 20s, looking uncomfortable with the entire situation. The third boat held more workers and equipment. They beached the boats 50 yards from where Jack and his group were hidden, and voices carried clearly across the water. Marcus was giving orders, his tone commanding and cruel, explaining how they'd harvest this section today and move deeper into the swamp tomorrow. But then he said something that made Jack's blood run cold. Marcus was talking about cleaning up loose ends, about making sure the woman and her brat couldn't cause any more problems. He mentioned specific locations deeper in the swamp where someone was hiding, someone who'd been evading them for weeks. The implication was clear and chilling. There was someone else out here. Someone Marcus wanted to silence permanently. Jack knew they had to leave immediately, get back to civilization and contact authorities. But as he started to signal retreat, Tommy made a mistake. The boy had been holding his water bottle awkwardly, and as he tried to shift position, it slipped from his grip. The aluminum container hit a rock with a sharp metallic clang that rang out across the clearing like a gunshot. Everyone froze. The men at the boats went silent, heads turning toward the sound. For one heartbeat, Jack hoped they might dismiss it as natural noise, but Marcus Reed was too experienced, too paranoid. He barked orders, and his men began moving toward their hiding spot, spreading out in a search pattern that would find them within minutes. Jack had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether they all lived or died. He could try to bluff, claim they were just innocent hikers, but Marcus would never believe that. Jack had testified against him, helped put him in prison, and Marcus's talk about loose ends suggested he was already committed to violence. Fighting was impossible. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with 2 civilians to protect. That left only one option. Jack whispered 3 words. Run. Now. Deep. Then he was moving, leading Sarah and Tommy away from the clearing at the fastest pace they could manage, heading not back toward their kayaks but deeper into the swamp where the terrain would be treacherous but might provide opportunities to lose their pursuers. Rex moved with them, but not following. Leading. Choosing a path with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Behind them, Jack heard shouts as Marcus's men discovered their abandoned position and realized their targets were fleeing. The sound of weapons being chambered carried through the trees. Then a gunshot cracked out, the bullet whining through branches above their heads, and Jack knew with absolute certainty that Marcus Reed intended to kill them all. The expedition to study eagles had just become a fight for survival against an enemy who had nothing left to lose and everything to hide. The swamp erupted into chaos as more gunshots echoed through the ancient trees, bullets striking bark and splashing into water with deadly intent. Jack pushed Sarah and Tommy ahead of him, his military training taking over as he calculated angles of fire and optimal escape routes while moving at a dead run through treacherous terrain. They crashed through palmetto thickets that tore at their clothes, splashed through shallow channels where the bottom could give way without warning, and ducked under low-hanging branches heavy with moss. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, men shouting coordinates to each other, engines roaring to life as boats repositioned to cut off escape routes. Marcus Reed's voice carried above the others, filled with rage and desperation, screaming orders to catch them at any cost. Rex ran at the front of their group with absolute purpose, his path seeming random at first, but Jack quickly realized the dog was avoiding the most dangerous terrain while heading in a specific direction, as if navigating toward a predetermined destination. They'd been running for perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours when Rex led them through a narrow gap between 2 massive cypress trees and into a channel so choked with vegetation that it was nearly invisible until you were right on top of it. The water here was darker, deeper, and the banks were treacherous slopes of mud that would provide no purchase if you slipped. But Rex didn't hesitate. plunging into the water and swimming with powerful strokes, looking back to ensure they followed. Jack went next, gasping at the cold, then helped Tommy and Sarah into the channel. The water was chest-deep and moving slightly, suggesting it connected to deeper waterways. They had to half swim, half wade, pushing through floating vegetation and praying they didn't encounter alligators or snakes in the murky darkness. The channel opened into a wider area where mist hung so thick that visibility dropped to perhaps 20 feet, creating a gray world where water and air seemed to merge into a single, disorienting element. Rex led them to a small hammock, a slightly elevated island of solid ground, barely large enough for all four of them, and Jack immediately recognized it as a defensive position. The hammock was surrounded by deep water on all sides, approachable only from specific directions, with good sight lines despite the mist. They crouched in the mud and grass, trying to control their breathing, listening for sounds of pursuit. For several minutes, there was only the natural noise of the swamp, frogs, insects, birds going about their lives unaware of the human drama. Then Jack heard the motors again, closer now, and Marcus's voice calling out with false friendliness that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier rage. Marcus was offering them a deal, claiming he just wanted to talk, promising they could all walk away if they came out peacefully. Jack knew it was a lie. Marcus couldn't afford to let them live now that they'd witnessed his illegal operation and heard him talk about murdering someone. Sarah was trembling, whether from cold or fear or both, and Tommy's eyes were wide with the kind of terror that could lead to panic. Jack gripped the boy's shoulder, made eye contact, and used the hand signals he'd taught him over months of training. Stay calm. Stay quiet. Trust me. Tommy nodded, visibly pulling himself together with the kind of courage that made Jack's chest ache with pride. Then Rex did something that made everything else pause. He moved to Jack's side and deliberately performed a specific action that no dog should have known. He placed his right paw on Jack's chest, then touched his nose to Jack's forehead, then returned his paw to Jack's chest in a precise, three-part sequence. It was Duke's signature greeting, the ritual they'd performed before every mission, a private communication that Jack had never taught to anyone or anything else. Jack's world tilted on its axis as he stared into Rex's eyes and finally, truly saw who was looking back at him. This wasn't a rescue dog who happened to have military training. This was Duke, his partner, his brother, his friend who he'd watched die 3 years ago, except he hadn't died. He'd survived somehow and ended up in a shelter with no way to communicate his identity until this moment when life or death stakes had finally broken through whatever barriers had kept them from recognizing each other. Jack's hands were shaking as he reached out, touching Duke's face, tracing the scars he'd been seeing for months without understanding what they meant. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered the name he'd been afraid to say. Duke. The dog's entire body vibrated with emotion, a whine building in his throat, and he repeated the gesture, more insistently this time. Jack pulled him close, pressing his face into the familiar neck, breathing in the scent that some part of him had always recognized, but his rational mind had refused to acknowledge. I thought you were dead, Jack whispered. I thought I'd lost you. Oh God, Duke, I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Duke licked Jack's face with the kind of desperate affection that spoke of his own relief at finally being recognized, at finally being home. Sarah and Tommy watched with confusion and growing understanding, but there was no time for explanations because the sound of motors was getting closer and voices were calling out that they'd found tracks leading to this area. Jack pulled himself together with effort, wiping his eyes and focusing on survival. But everything had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. His partner was back. And together they would get everyone out of this alive. The reunion transformed their desperate flight into something more strategic and coordinated. Jack and Duke fell into old patterns without conscious thought, communicating through gestures and signals developed over years of working together in life-threatening situations. When Jack pointed with 2 fingers toward the northeast, Duke understood immediately that they needed to move in that direction. When Duke gave a specific series of low barks, 1 long, 3 short, Jack knew it meant danger ahead, but a clear path to the right. They moved as a unit, with Duke ranging ahead to scout and returning to guide them around obstacles and threats. Sarah and Tommy followed, their earlier panic replaced by cautious hope as they witnessed the extraordinary partnership in action. Duke led them through water so thick with duckweed that it looked like solid ground, across a fallen log bridge that would have been invisible to human eyes, and finally into a section of swamp where the cypress trees grew so densely that the canopy blocked most of the light. The darkness and vegetation would make it nearly impossible for Marcus's men to track them. But Duke moved through it with confidence, his nose processing information Jack couldn't perceive. They'd been moving for perhaps 20 minutes when Duke suddenly stopped, his posture changing from movement mode to alert investigation. He was fixated on something ahead, something that made him both cautious and excited. Jack signaled for everyone to wait while he moved forward carefully to see what Duke had found. What emerged from the gloom ahead was a sight so unexpected that Jack initially couldn't process it. A massive nest, easily 6 feet across, built in the branches of an enormous cypress tree about 30 feet off the ground. A bald eagle sat on the nest, clearly visible even in the dim light. But the bird's behavior was completely wrong. It should have been screeching warnings at their approach, defending its territory aggressively. Instead, it watched them calmly, almost expectantly. Then Jack saw what Duke had been reacting to. There was something below the nest, a small opening in the base of the tree that looked like it might lead to a hollow interior or a cave. And from that opening came a sound that made Jack's heart clench, the weak, mewling cry of an infant. Duke moved toward the sound without Jack's command, approaching the tree with his head low and his tail in a neutral position, the body language of a dog trying to appear non-threatening. Jack followed, his mind racing through impossible scenarios, trying to understand what a baby could possibly be doing in the deepest part of Okefenokee Swamp. As they got closer, Jack could see that the opening did lead into the hollow tree, and there was movement inside. Someone was in there. He called out softly, trying not to sound threatening. "Hello? We're here to help. Please. We know you're in danger. Let us help you." For a long moment, there was only silence and the continued crying of the baby. Then a voice, female and weak with exhaustion, spoke from the darkness. "Are you with Marcus Reed?" The terror in those words was palpable. Jack answered immediately. "No, we're running from him too. My name is Jack Morrison. I'm a veteran, and Reed is trying to kill us because we witnessed his illegal logging operation. Please, let us help you." Another pause. Then, "I know your name. My father talked about you before Marcus killed him. You testified against Reed 5 years ago. You helped put him in prison." Jack's blood ran cold. "Who was your father?" The answer came with the sound of movement, and slowly, carefully, a young woman emerged from the hollow tree, holding a tiny infant wrapped in what looked like a torn jacket. She was painfully thin, her clothes filthy and torn, her face showing the ravages of stress and malnutrition. But her eyes were clear and determined as she said, "My name is Emily Crawford. My father was Daniel Crawford, the investigative journalist who disappeared 13 months ago while investigating Marcus Reed's criminal operations. Marcus didn't just kill him. He murdered him right here in this swamp with the help of Sheriff Bobby Martinez." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making him stagger backward a step. Bobby Martinez, his friend. The man he'd trusted with their route plan, their expected return time, their exact location. Bobby was working with Marcus Reed. Suddenly, everything made terrible sense. How Marcus had known they were in the swamp, how his men had found them so quickly, why Bobby had tried so hard to convince Jack to postpone the trip. Bobby hadn't been warning Jack out of concern. He'd been trying to keep him away from this area because Emily was hiding here and Marcus was actively hunting her. And Jack had told Bobby everything, essentially giving Marcus their location and ensuring they'd walk right into danger. The betrayal cut deep, but there was no time to process it, because Emily was continuing her story in a rush, words spilling out, as if she'd been holding them inside for too long. She explained that 13 months ago, her father had been investigating Reed's operations, gathering evidence of not just illegal logging, but also wildlife trafficking. Alligator hides, eagle feathers, bear parts, all sold on black markets for enormous profit. Bobby Martinez had been Reed's partner from the beginning, using his position as sheriff to cover up crimes and intimidate witnesses. When Daniel Crawford had gotten too close to exposing them, they'd lured him into the swamp under the pretense of showing him proof of their crimes. Instead, they'd killed him and hidden his body somewhere in the deep water where it would never be found. Emily had been following her father at a distance that day, worried about his safety. And she'd witnessed the murder from concealment. She'd wanted to go to the authorities immediately. But then she'd overheard Marcus and Bobby discussing how they'd eliminate anyone connected to Daniel's investigation, including his family. Emily had been pregnant at the time. Her boyfriend had died in a car accident 3 months earlier, and she'd realized that going public meant signing both her and her unborn child's death warrant. Bobby controlled the local law enforcement, and Marcus had connections throughout the county. So she'd run, disappearing into the swamp using skills her father had taught her during childhood camping trips. She'd been surviving out here for over a year, moving constantly, living off fish and edible plants, staying ahead of the search parties Marcus regularly sent into the swamp. 2 weeks ago, she'd gone into labor alone in the wilderness. She'd managed to deliver the baby herself in this hollow tree, using water from the swamp and torn pieces of her own clothing. Since then, she'd been trapped here, too weak to travel far with a newborn, but knowing Marcus was closing in. The eagle nest above her hollow tree had been built just before the baby was born. And Emily described something that seemed impossible, but that she swore was true. The mother eagle hadn't attacked her. Instead, the bird had seemed to recognize Emily as another mother protecting offspring, and had begun bringing extra fish, dropping them near the hollow tree entrance as if deliberately feeding the human below. More than that, the eagle had become aggressive toward anyone else who approached, dive-bombing Marcus's search parties multiple times and driving them away from this specific area. It was as if nature itself had decided to protect the desperate mother and her child. Emily had been hoping someone, anyone, would eventually stumble across her hiding place. Someone she could trust to get a message to authorities beyond Marcus and Bobby's control. She'd been slowly starving, her milk drying up, watching her baby grow weaker, knowing they couldn't survive much longer, but too terrified to risk exposure. Duke had somehow detected their presence from miles away, had been trying to lead Jack to this location for weeks, and had finally succeeded by guiding them here during their escape from Marcus. Sarah immediately moved to help, her biology background giving her enough medical knowledge to assess Emily and the baby. Both were severely malnourished and dehydrated, but alive. The baby, a girl Emily had named Hope, was tiny and weak, but had no obvious injuries or infections. Sarah used supplies from their packs to provide clean water and emergency rations, working with efficient compassion while Tommy kept watch. Jack's mind was racing through tactical options, all of them bad. They were deep in hostile territory, being hunted by men with weapons and local knowledge, unable to trust law enforcement, with 2 civilians who couldn't fight and 2 more who could barely walk. Their satellite phone was in the kayak they'd abandoned miles away. Their only advantage was that Marcus didn't yet know they'd found Emily. Didn't know that his secret was now shared by witnesses who were still alive. But that advantage would disappear the moment he found them. Jack was trying to formulate a plan when they heard the sound that meant their time had run out. Motors, multiple boats, coming from different directions in a coordinated search pattern. Marcus had brought in reinforcements and was conducting a systematic sweep of the area. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the search reached this location. Duke was already moving, taking up a defensive position between the approaching threat and the group, his body language making clear he was prepared to fight to protect them. Jack made a decision. He couldn't run with Emily and the baby in their current condition, couldn't hide effectively with an infant who might cry at any moment, couldn't talk their way out because Marcus couldn't afford to let any of them survive. That left only one option. They had to make a stand here and hope they could hold out long enough for help to arrive, even though Jack had no idea how that help would come. He positioned Sarah, Emily, and the baby inside the hollow tree, where they'd have some protection. He gave Tommy a knife and instructions to stay with the women and defend them if anyone got past Jack. Then he and Duke moved to establish a defensive perimeter, using the massive tree as anchor point and the dense vegetation as concealment. Jack had his pistol with 3 magazines, 45 rounds total. Against multiple men with rifles, it wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The first boat appeared through the mist, moving slowly, men with weapons scanning the banks for any sign of their quarry. Jack recognized one of Marcus's men from earlier, a hard-faced individual with a rifle held at ready position. The boat was still 50 yards away, not yet in effective pistol range, when Duke did something that made Jack's tactical brain kick into high gear. The dog gave a specific bark pattern, 2 short, 1 long, pause, repeat, that in their old unit had meant enemy approaching, suggest ambush. Duke was right. If they let Marcus's men get close enough to spot them, the fight would start on the enemy's terms. Better to engage now, on their own terms, using surprise as a weapon. Jack whistled a response code that meant acknowledged, execute, and Duke immediately began executing a distraction maneuver Jack had thought the dog might have forgotten. Duke broke cover and deliberately showed himself to the men in the boat, barking aggressively to draw their attention, then disappeared back into the vegetation before they could shoot. The men immediately shouted to others, calling in Duke's position, and 3 boats began converging on the area. But Duke was already moving, appearing in a different location, barking again, leading them away from the hollow tree and the people hiding inside. It was a classic misdirection, something they'd used dozens of times in combat, and it worked perfectly. Marcus's men followed Duke, spreading out to surround what they thought was the dog's position, leaving their boats temporarily unguarded. Jack used the opportunity to move, circling through the water with barely a ripple, approaching the nearest boat from behind. The man left to guard it never heard Jack coming until it was too late. Jack struck fast and silent, using techniques learned in hand-to-hand combat training, rendering the guard unconscious and taking his rifle and ammunition. Now the odds were slightly better, but Marcus Reed wasn't a fool, and he quickly realized they were being manipulated. His voice boomed out across the swamp, calling off the pursuit of Duke and ordering his men to return to the boats and regroup. Then he did something that made Jack's blood turn to ice. Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly in the heavy air. "Jack Morrison, I know you're out there, and I know you found Emily Crawford and her bastard child. Bobby Martinez just radioed me your exact position from the GPS tracker he placed on your kayak when he visited you this morning. You're surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. But I'm a reasonable man. Come out now, hand over Emily and the evidence she's carrying, and I'll let you and your friends go. You have my word. Refuse, and I'll burn this entire section of swamp until you suffocate or come out screaming." To emphasize his point, one of Marcus's men fired a flare gun into the cypress branches, and within seconds, flames began licking at the dry Spanish moss, spreading with horrifying speed. The swamp might be wet, but the vegetation accumulated over centuries would burn hot and fast once ignited. Marcus was willing to destroy acres of protected wilderness and risk his own life in a fire just to eliminate witnesses. Jack understood in that moment that they were facing someone who'd passed beyond rational thought into desperate madness, someone who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets and exact revenge on those who'd wronged him. The fire was spreading, smoke beginning to choke the air, and Jack had to make a decision. Surrender meant death. Marcus would never let them live regardless of his promises. Running was impossible with Emily and Hope unable to move quickly. Fighting seemed futile against superior numbers, but there was one thing Marcus hadn't accounted for, one variable that might change the equation. Duke wasn't just a dog. He was a decorated military working dog with years of combat experience, trained in tactics that civilian criminals had never encountered. Jack whistled a command he hadn't used in 3 years, complex sequence that meant tactical assault, multiple targets, execute on my signal. Duke's response was immediate and precise, a bark pattern that confirmed readiness and requested target priority. Jack used hand signals to indicate the nearest boat, the one with Marcus Reed standing in the bow, directing operations. Then he whistled the execute command and opened fire on the other boats, forcing men to take cover and creating chaos. Duke launched his attack in the same instant, a blur of muscle and fury streaking through the water toward Marcus's boat, with the kind of speed that made him nearly impossible to track. Marcus saw the dog coming and tried to bring his rifle around, but Duke was already airborne, jaws clamping onto Marcus's gun arm with crushing force. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as man and dog crashed into the bottom of the boat, struggling violently. Cole Reed, Marcus's son, was in the boat too, and he raised his own weapon toward Duke. But something in his face suggested hesitation, conflict, an unwillingness to shoot the dog who was attacking his father. That moment of hesitation proved crucial because it gave Jack time to take aim and fire, not at Cole, but at the boat's motor, destroying it and leaving the vessel dead in the water. Marcus was screaming, trying to shake Duke off, but the dog had locked his jaw in the way German shepherds were bred to do, holding on despite Marcus's frantic attempts to strike him. Then something happened that Jack would never forget. Cole Reed, instead of helping his father, instead of shooting Duke, suddenly pointed his phone at the scene and started speaking rapidly. He was live streaming, broadcasting everything. His father's crimes, the murder confession Marcus had made earlier, the assault on innocent people, all of it going out to the internet in real time where it couldn't be deleted or suppressed. Cole was yelling over the chaos. "My name is Cole Reed, and I'm documenting the crimes of my father, Marcus Reed, and Sheriff Bobby Martinez. They've been running illegal operations for years. They murdered journalist Daniel Crawford. They're trying to kill witnesses right now, including a woman and her infant child. Someone call the FBI, call the state police, send help to Okefenokee Swamp coordinates." He rattled off GPS coordinates that he must have pulled from his phone, repeating them multiple times. Marcus finally managed to throw Duke off, and he turned toward his son with murder in his eyes, screaming about betrayal and weakness. He raised his pistol toward Cole, his own son, fully prepared to kill him to stop the broadcast. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, aiming not to kill but to disable. 2 rounds hit Marcus's shoulder and leg, spinning him around and dropping him into the bottom of the boat. The 3rd shot shattered Bobby Martinez's windshield as the sheriff's boat suddenly appeared through the smoke, having apparently been monitoring the situation from a distance. Bobby had his weapon drawn and was aiming toward Jack's position, but Duke was already moving, having released Marcus and identified the new threat. The dog hit the water again, swimming with powerful strokes toward Bobby's boat, and the sheriff made a critical mistake. He turned his attention and weapon toward the approaching dog, taking his focus off Jack. It was exactly the opening Jack needed. He fired again, hitting Bobby's hand and sending the sheriff's gun spinning into the water. Bobby clutched his bleeding hand, his face twisted with rage and pain, screaming threats and curses, but he was disarmed and no longer a threat. The other men who'd been working for Marcus suddenly found themselves uncertain, their leaders down, their crimes being broadcast to the world, and police sirens beginning to wail in the distance as someone, probably many people, who'd seen Cole's livestream had called 911. The standoff that followed was tense, but brief. Jack kept his weapon trained on the boats while Duke maintained a position between the threats and the hollow tree. Sarah emerged with Emily and baby Hope, all three of them coughing from the smoke, but alive. Tommy came out last, still holding the knife Jack had given him, his face showing the kind of adult awareness that comes from facing real danger and surviving. Marcus Reed lay bleeding in his boat, cursing weakly, while Cole kept the phone camera rolling and provided running commentary about everything they'd done. Bobby Martinez tried to start his engine and flee, but Duke swam to his boat and disabled the motor by tearing out essential wiring, a trick Jack had taught him years ago for disabling enemy vehicles. Within 20 minutes, the sound of multiple boats and a helicopter approached, state police responding to the emergency calls generated by Cole's viral live stream. The FBI arrived shortly after, having been contacted by their social media monitoring team after Cole's broadcast started lighting up the internet with millions of views. Emily Crawford was finally safe. Her father's murder would be avenged. Marcus Reed and Bobby Martinez would spend the rest of their lives in prison. And Jack Morrison stood in the middle of it all, smoke-stained and exhausted, with his arm around Duke, the partner he'd thought he'd lost forever, but who'd saved them all through courage, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty. The immediate aftermath was controlled chaos as law enforcement secured the scene, arrested Marcus and Bobby, and arranged emergency medical evacuation for Emily and Hope. Cole Reed surrendered voluntarily, offering full cooperation and providing additional evidence he'd been secretly collecting for months after growing suspicious of his father's activities. The young man was racked with guilt, but determined to make amends, and the authorities indicated he'd likely receive immunity in exchange for testimony. EMTs checked everyone over. Sarah had minor injuries, Tommy was physically fine but emotionally shaken, and Jack had bruises and cuts he didn't remember getting. Duke was examined by a wildlife veterinarian who happened to be part of the response team, and she identified him as having the build and scarring consistent with a retired military working dog. When Jack explained Duke's history and how they'd finally recognized each other, the veterinarian pulled up records that confirmed everything. Duke had been declared killed in action, but a field medic had managed to revive him after Jack had been evacuated from the scene. The dog had been so severely injured that he'd been transferred through multiple facilities for reconstructive surgery, developing PTSD along the way that made him unsuitable for continued military service. Through bureaucratic incompetence or simple human error, no one had ever contacted Jack to tell him Duke survived. The dog had been retired, placed in rehabilitation, and eventually released to a rescue organization under a new name, with his military history redacted for security reasons. It was a cascade of failures that had kept them apart, but also perhaps a strange mercy that had brought them back together exactly when they both needed each other most. As Jack sat on solid ground for the first time in what felt like days, with Duke pressed against his side and the nightmare finally over, he found himself thinking about fate and second chances, and the mysterious ways that love persists even across impossible distances. 2 weeks after the confrontation in Okefenokee Swamp, Jack Morrison stood in a federal courtroom and watched justice finally prevail. Marcus Reed was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole on charges that included first-degree murder, attempted murder, environmental crimes, wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, and weapons violations. The judge's words were harsh and uncompromising, condemning Reed not just for his crimes, but for the callous disregard for human life he'd demonstrated by trying to murder a mother and infant. Bobby Martinez received an identical sentence, with additional charges for corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice that made his betrayal of public trust particularly egregious. Both men would die in prison, their legacies forever tainted by greed and violence. Cole Reed, in contrast, was offered a plea deal that resulted in 5 years of probation, 2,000 hours of community service, and permanent testimony obligations in related cases. The young man had made mistakes, but his decision to turn against his father and broadcast the truth had saved lives and brought justice. The judge acknowledged that Cole's actions represented genuine remorse and moral courage, giving him a chance to build a better life than his father had modeled. Daniel Crawford's family finally had answers after 13 months of agonizing uncertainty, and his remains were eventually recovered from the swamp and given a proper burial. Emily Crawford and baby Hope were reunited with Emily's mother and extended family, beginning the long process of physical and emotional recovery. The eagle nest that had sheltered them was designated a protected site, with biologists planning long-term studies of the remarkable behavior the mother eagle had displayed. The story became national news, with millions following the updates and debating the mysterious bond between species that had manifested in such extraordinary circumstances. Jack found himself thrust into unwanted spotlight as media outlets requested interviews and documentary producers offered contracts. But he declined almost everything, wanting only to return to the quiet life he'd built in his cabin. What had changed, though, was that the life was no longer solitary or defined by loss. Duke was home, truly home, and the walls Jack had built around his heart had finally come down. He could love again, could trust again, could believe in the possibility of joy after tragedy. Sarah Chen had become a fixture in his life as well, her visits to the cabin increasing in frequency and duration until it became clear to both of them that something deeper than friendship was developing. She understood his need for space and silence, but she also pulled him gently back toward human connection, toward community, toward a future that held more than just survival. Tommy Briggs came by 3 times a week for training and mentorship, and Jack discovered that teaching the boy gave him purpose in ways he hadn't expected. He was passing on knowledge, building something that would outlast him, creating meaning from the skills he'd developed through years of service. The nightmares that had plagued Jack for so long began to diminish, not disappearing entirely, but losing their power to control his life. Duke's presence at night made all the difference, the dog's steady breathing and warm weight against his leg, providing an anchor to reality when memories threatened to pull him under. Jack had started attending a veterans support group in town, encouraged by Sarah, and finding unexpected comfort in sharing experiences with others who understood. He was learning that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on, but about integrating loss into a life that could still hold beauty and connection. The cabin itself underwent changes, becoming less of a fortress against the world and more of a home where friends gathered and laughter echoed. The bond between Jack and Duke deepened in ways that went beyond their military partnership, evolving into something richer and more complex. They understood each other with the kind of wordless communication that comes from shared trauma and mutual salvation. Duke had saved Jack's life multiple times over the years, but Jack had also saved Duke by giving him a home when he was broken and lost, by loving him even when he didn't recognize who the dog truly was. Each evening, they would sit on the cabin's porch overlooking the swamp, watching sunset paint the water gold and crimson, and Jack would rest his hand on Duke's head while both of them simply existed in peaceful companionship. Duke had regained much of his confidence through the events in the swamp, the experience of facing danger and protecting his pack seeming to heal something that had been fractured by his combat trauma. He still had triggers. Sudden loud noises could send him into alert mode, but the panicked confusion had been replaced by controlled awareness. Jack understood because he experienced the same thing, and together they helped each other navigate the aftermath of war. Tommy had asked Jack once why Duke was so special, why this particular dog meant so much when Jack had worked with dozens of military dogs over the years. Jack had struggled to articulate it, finally settling on an answer that felt true, even if incomplete. Duke had seen him at his worst and his best, had trusted him with absolute faith, even in situations where death seemed certain, had chosen him over and over again, despite having every reason to give up. That kind of loyalty, that kind of love, was rare enough between humans, and almost miraculous between species. Duke wasn't just a dog. He was family, brother, partner, friend. All the words people used but rarely meant with the depth that this relationship embodied. 3 months after the trial, Jack stood in the clearing behind his cabin, where he'd built a small memorial to those he'd lost over the years. There were markers for his wife, for soldiers from his unit who hadn't made it home, for the working dogs who'd died in service. He'd added a new element to the memorial, a granite stone engraved with words that represented everything he'd learned through pain and survival and unexpected grace. The inscription read, "In war and in peace, the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with loyalty, courage, and an unbreakable bond between those who trust each other completely." Below that, he'd added the names of his wife, Sarah, his partner, Duke, and Daniel Crawford, honoring all those who'd shaped his understanding of sacrifice and love. Duke sat beside him as he stood before the memorial, the dog's presence a reminder that loss wasn't the end of the story. Life continued. Connections formed and reformed. Love persisted even across the boundaries of death and separation, finding ways to return when you needed it most. Jack had spent years defining himself by what he'd lost, but standing there with Duke pressed against his leg and the sounds of the swamp rising around them, he finally understood that he could also define himself by what he'd found: purpose, healing, community, and the miracle of a second chance with the partner he'd thought was gone forever. The mother eagle that had protected Emily and Hope had taught them all something profound about the instincts that transcend individual survival, about the ways that protection and nurturing can manifest in unexpected forms. Just as that bird had recognized and defended a desperate mother, Duke had recognized and guided Jack even when neither of them fully understood what was happening. Some bonds, Jack realized, were too deep to be severed by circumstance or time, or even apparent death. As autumn gave way to winter and the swamp transformed into a landscape of bare trees and cold water, Jack found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself to consider for years. Sarah had raised the possibility of him teaching wilderness survival courses for at-risk youth, using his skills and Duke's abilities to provide life-changing experiences for kids like Tommy, who needed direction and purpose. The idea appealed to Jack, offering a way to serve that didn't require returning to combat, but still utilized everything he'd learned. He'd also been contacted by the Veterans Administration about training other veterans to work with rescue dogs, creating partnerships that could provide therapeutic benefits for both humans and animals. The projects gave him goals beyond simple day-to-day survival, reconnecting him to the larger world in manageable ways. Emily Crawford had sent him a letter, her words expressing gratitude that felt almost overwhelming in its depth. She told him that Hope was thriving, gaining weight and hitting developmental milestones, a happy baby unaware of how close she'd come to never having a chance at life. Emily herself was in therapy, processing the trauma of her father's murder and her own ordeal, but she was determined to honor Daniel Crawford's legacy by continuing his work as an investigative journalist. She planned to write a book about the events, about corruption in small-town America, about environmental crimes, and about the extraordinary courage of ordinary people when faced with evil. Jack had given her permission to tell his and Duke's story, hoping it might inspire others to adopt rescue animals and support veterans dealing with PTSD and service dogs dealing with their own invisible wounds. The cabin had become a gathering place for a small but growing community of people who understood that healing happened in connection rather than isolation. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, a rare event in Georgia that transformed the swamp into something magical and strange. Jack called Duke to the porch and sat beside him in the rocking chair his grandfather had built decades ago. The dog was older now, showing gray in his muzzle and moving with the slight stiffness that came from years of hard use and old injuries. But his eyes were still bright, and his loyalty still absolute. Jack wrapped a blanket around both of them and spoke aloud, something he did sometimes when emotions felt too large to contain silently. "You know, Duke, I spent so long thinking I'd lost everything that mattered. I built my whole life around grief, around the idea that the best parts of my life were behind me. But you came back. Against impossible odds, through circumstances we'll never fully understand, you found your way back to me. And in doing so, you reminded me that life doesn't end when we lose something precious. It transforms. It continues. We carry the people and the experiences that shaped us. But we also get to create new memories, new connections, new reasons to wake up each morning. I don't know if I believe in fate or divine intervention or just incredible coincidence, but I know this. Finding you again saved me just as surely as you saved Emily and Hope. You gave me back the part of myself I'd lost when I thought you died. You proved that loyalty and love persist even when everything suggests they should fail. For that, for all of it, thank you. Thank you for not giving up, for surviving when it would have been easier to let go, for recognizing me even when I was too blind to see you. You're my brother, Duke. You always were, and you always will be." Duke responded by placing his head on Jack's lap, a gesture of contentment and connection, and together they watched snow fall on the ancient swamp, while the night settled around them with the peaceful certainty that they were finally, truly home. The call to action came naturally as Jack thought about the countless people who might be living with their own losses, their own separations from things and beings they'd loved. He thought about veterans struggling with PTSD, about rescue animals waiting in shelters for someone to recognize their value, about the extraordinary healing that could happen when broken souls found each other. Have you ever witnessed the incredible bond between a veteran and their loyal companion, or experienced the miracle of a second chance when you thought all hope was lost? Share your story in the comments below, because these connections matter more than we sometimes realize. Every story of loyalty, courage, and survival adds to our collective understanding of what makes life meaningful. Let's honor these unbreakable connections together, creating a community where loss and healing can coexist, where the bonds between humans and animals are recognized as sacred, and where no one has to face their darkest moments alone. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own companions or your own battles, please subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing these stories of extraordinary courage in ordinary lives. We document the veterans who serve, the animals who protect and heal, and the unexpected miracles that happen when loyalty transcends circumstances. These stories need to be told. These bonds need to be celebrated. And together we can ensure that the sacrifices made by both humans and animals are never forgotten. Don't miss the next incredible journey waiting for you. There's another story of courage and survival appearing on your screen right now. Another testament to the unbreakable bonds that define our humanity. Click to watch how another veteran and their faithful companion faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through nothing more than trust, determination, and love that refused to die. Thank you for being here, for listening, for caring about these stories that remind us what truly matters. And most importantly, thank you to all veterans and their families for your service and sacrifice, for the price you paid to protect others, and for the courage you demonstrate every single day as you navigate the aftermath of that service. You are not forgotten. Your stories matter, and somewhere out there, a loyal companion might be waiting to find their way back to you, just as Duke found his way back to Jack in the darkest heart of a Georgia swamp, where a mother eagle proved that protection and love transcend all boundaries.